Jasmine Crockett stepped into the plane's first class cabin with a quiet kind of confidence that didn't ask for attention, but naturally drew eyes. She had just wrapped up a heated but inspiring interview on national television and needed time to think, to breathe, to be alone with her thoughts at 30,000 feet. She placed her bag in the overhead bin, adjusted her seat with a calm rhythm, and sat down, hoping for a moment of peace before the next wave of headlines. The flight attendant walked by, sharp, hurried, and without making eye contact, only stopping to scan her seat assignment with a frown. She leaned in and with a clipped tone said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" "This section is first class." Jasmine looked up calmly. "Yes, 2A." The attendant didn't respond right away. She just stood there, glancing down at Jasmine's outfit, smart, comfortable, professional, but not the usual luxury labels others nearby were flashing, and then she asked again, louder this time, drawing the attention of the nearby passengers. "I just need to confirm, you're in the right place?" Jasmine felt the heat crawl up her neck, not from guilt or doubt, but from the familiar burn of being questioned in spaces where people didn't expect her to belong. She handed over her boarding pass with a steady hand. The attendant looked down at it, then back at Jasmine, and still didn't offer an apology. "Just making sure," she muttered and walked off, leaving an air thick with judgment and whispers. One man a row behind her gave her a slight nod of support, but most passengers just returned to their magazines and headphones, pretending nothing had happened. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't respond. But inside her mind, something stirred. Not anger, not even pride. Just a strong knowing that moments like these weren't just hers to carry. They belonged to every person who'd been doubted, dismissed, or made to feel out of place in rooms they'd earned their way into. The plane took off. She sat still, her eyes locked on the clouds just beyond the glass, thinking about how often the world tried to humble people, not by truth, but by assumption. The same people who would see her speeches go viral, who would retweet her fiery floor statements, were now side-eyeing her in first class like she'd wandered in by mistake. It wasn't about the seat. It was about what people thought that seat meant and who they believed deserved to sit in it. The attendant returned later with drinks. She skipped Jasmine at first, then backtracked with forced politeness. "Would you like a drink?" Jasmine said. "Just water, thanks." She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't return the discomfort. But her silence was loud. The woman handed her the water with a slight tremble now, sensing something had shifted, but not knowing what. The man across the aisle, a businessman in his late 50s, leaned over after a while. "You handled that better than I would have. Sorry you had to deal with that." Jasmine turned to him and said, "You know what the hardest part is? It's not being underestimated. It's knowing that even when you succeed, people still think it must be a fluke." He looked away, unsure what to say. She wasn't bitter, she was clear. Every part of her calm presence was a response louder than any outburst. The flight continued. But what happened next would ripple far beyond the cabin. The whispers, the glances, the embarrassed looks, none of it could prepare the flight crew or the passengers for what was coming by the time they landed. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Jasmine Crockett sat still, her hands gently resting on the tray table, water untouched, her eyes focused straight ahead but seeing far beyond the cabin walls. The hum of the engines was low, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the moment still echoing inside her. She wasn't unfamiliar with disrespect. Politics trained her for that, but this wasn't about her title. This was about something deeper. She had faced senators on the floor of Congress, stood tall under the fire of media spin, but something about this kind of quiet public humiliation lingered heavier than all those other moments combined. This was about a stranger trying to define her place. And not because of her words or actions, but simply because she was a black woman sitting in seat 2A. She hadn't moved or spoken since the man across the aisle apologized to her. She didn't need to. The flight attendant, Lynn, Her name tag read had started to pick up on the shift in the air. Passengers weren't laughing or clinking glasses as usual. A few were visibly uncomfortable. A woman nearby had taken out her phone and was clearly recording discreetly from the side of her seat, eyes flickering toward Jasmine now and then. The cabin wasn't hostile, it was heavy, tense, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't name. Lynn approached again with meals, cart rattling as she moved slowly row by row. When she got to Jasmine, she didn't speak. She placed the meal tray down without eye contact and began to move on. But this time, Jasmine looked up. "I appreciate the meal," Jasmine said softly, but clearly enough that it could be heard by those around her. "But I also appreciate accountability," Lynn froze. Her hands slightly shook as she gripped the cart. "Excuse me?" she asked, feigning confusion. Jasmine didn't blink. "I noticed the difference in how you treated me compared to every other first-class passenger here. So did others. I don't want an apology because it's expected. I want you to think about why you assumed I didn't belong." The silence that followed was instant and piercing. The businessman across from her slowly leaned back in his chair, lips pressed tight. The woman recording seemed to subtly angle her phone more directly now. Lynn didn't reply at first. Her face flushed, her posture stiffened. She tried to force a smile and said, "It was just procedure. I ask everyone." Jasmine cut her off with no sharpness, only certainty. "No, you don't. You didn't ask anyone else around me for proof. I watched. You skipped right past them with smiles and wine lists. You asked me twice. There it was. The truth of it, not shouted. Not weaponized. Just laid bare, like a mirror in front of the entire cabin. People were listening now, really listening. A few tried to look away, but most couldn't. And Lynn, she wilted a little in the silence. "I didn't mean anything by it," she finally mumbled, but it rang hollow. Jasmine leaned back, picking up the water she hadn't touched before. "That's always how it goes," she said, more to the air than to Lynn. "But it does mean something, every time." Then she sipped calmly. Lynn stood there, unsure whether to say more, apologize, retreat, or continue with service like nothing had happened. But there was no escaping what had already unfolded. The rest of the cabin was watching a different kind of leadership at work, one that didn't require a podium or a mic. Just grace under fire and truth without anger. The pilot's voice broke the tension a few moments later, announcing their descent would begin in 20 minutes. People adjusted their seats. The woman recording quietly put her phone away and leaned toward Jasmine. "You don't know me," she said in a low voice, "but thank you for saying what I couldn't." Jasmine gave her a gentle nod, no more than that. It was enough. These weren't the kinds of moments that made headlines, but they were the ones that made change. The cabin had returned to a kind of hushed normal, but only on the surface. Flight attendants resumed their duties with careful steps, avoiding any more direct contact with Jasmine unless it was necessary. The air, though calm, was far from comfortable. Something had shifted. Not just in the atmosphere, but in the eyes of the passengers. Everyone had just witnessed a moment that peeled back layers of everyday professionalism and exposed a truth that many often avoided confronting. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded retribution, and yet she had unsettled the room in a way louder people often failed to do. Her dignity had done the speaking, and that was what people couldn't stop thinking about. As the plane continued to cruise, a soft chime signaled the seatbelt light turning back on. An announcement about turbulence came next, and passengers began returning trays and putting away devices. Jasmine remained composed, fingers gently brushing the rim of her empty glass. Her thoughts miles away, but her expression unreadable. Just then, from the back of the first-class section, another attendant slowly made her way forward. She was older, with silver-streaked hair neatly tied up, and a presence that suggested experience and care. Her name tag read Marilyn. She bent slightly at Jasmine's side. lowering her voice to a whisper, but one still audible to those nearby. "I want to say I'm sorry, not just for what happened, but for the fact that it wasn't the first time for you. I saw it, I didn't stop it, and that's on me too." Jasmine turned to look at her, and for a moment, their eyes held a silent exchange of pain, honesty, and quiet acknowledgement. Marilyn gently placed a small envelope on Jasmine's tray and whispered, "This isn't company protocol. This is personal." Then she stepped back and continued down the aisle, not waiting for a thank you or reaction. Jasmine didn't open the envelope right away. She stared at it, uncertain whether to accept what it represented or question why moments like these had to feel so rare. Suddenly, the turbulence they had been warned about began to shake the cabin. Not violently, but enough to cause cups to rattle and murmurs to rise. Jasmine calmly fastened her seatbelt. Others followed. And as the plane slightly dipped before leveling again, there was a sudden call from the front. An older woman in seat 1B gasped and reached for her chest. Flight attendants rushed forward. A defibrillator kit was pulled from a wall compartment. The mood in the cabin shifted from quiet discomfort to concern. Jasmine, watching everything unfold, instinctively stood despite the light being on. She moved forward, steady but careful, and asked clearly, "Does anyone need help?" The lead flight attendant hesitated before nodding quickly. She said, "She's diabetic. We're looking for her insulin, but..." Jasmine knelt by the passenger's side, taking the woman's cold hand in hers. "I've seen this before," she said softly, trying to help keep her calm while the flight attendants located a small red case inside her carry-on. The old woman, pale and trembling, looked up at Jasmine and whispered, "You're that congresswoman, aren't you?" Jasmine smiled and nodded once. "Right now I'm just someone who's here. And I'm not going anywhere." The old woman's eyes watered as her breathing began to stabilize. Marilyn returned with the insulin pen and helped administer it under emergency protocol. Slowly, color returned to the woman's face. She rested her head back and whispered, "Thank you, both." Marilyn looked at Jasmine and simply said, "You have a calm that changes a room." The turbulence finally passed. The passengers had witnessed something entirely different now. Not just dignity under pressure, but strength under compassion. Jasmine quietly returned to her seat, a few passengers giving her small nods, others gently clapping, subdued but sincere. Then, almost as if the moment was destined, Lynn returned, not with food, not with protocol, but holding a paper cup with fresh ginger tea. She didn't speak at first, just placed it gently on Jasmine's tray and waited. "I didn't think I had anything left to learn in this job," she said after a long pause. "But I was wrong. You taught me something I should have known long ago." Jasmine studied her carefully. There was no script this time, no forced smile. Just vulnerability. "I appreciate that," Jasmine finally said. "Most don't admit when they're wrong, but what matters is what happens after." Lynn nodded, her voice shaking slightly. "I'll remember this flight for the rest of my life, not because of turbulence or policy, but because I misjudged someone who showed me more grace than I deserved." And with that, Lynn turned and walked away, back to her duties, this time a little slower, a little quieter, but entirely different. Jasmine leaned back, looked out the window at the thick clouds below, and finally allowed herself to breathe. The plane still had time before landing, but something inside her had already touched ground. The flight had entered a steady glide toward its descent, but inside the cabin, everything felt suspended in time. There was still an unsettling quietness, though this time it wasn't due to tension, but rather an unspoken understanding between the passengers. Something about the last few minutes, the way Jasmine had handled everything, had changed the atmosphere. They had all witnessed someone who had not only endured, but had been the calm in the chaos, a calm that somehow became contagious. The flight attendants now moved with more care, and the passengers whispered among themselves, some nodding toward Jasmine, their eyes filled with newfound respect. Jasmine hadn't sought it out. In fact, She preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But life had a way of pulling you into moments where you either rise or stay silent. And Jasmine had risen, quietly but powerfully. Her fingers ran across the rim of the teacup, still warm, as her gaze drifted over the rows of seats, now more occupied with passengers who were just as lost in thought. What they had witnessed had shifted the mood, and Jasmine, as much as she tried to retreat into her thoughts, found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted to be. In the back, she could hear Lynn talking to another flight attendant. "I've been doing this for years, and I don't think I've ever seen someone handle a crisis like that." The way she stayed calm, kept it together even after everything. The other attendant nodded, clearly in agreement. "She's incredible. I never would have thought, looking at her before. You never know who's really carrying that kind of strength." It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. Jasmine had been underestimated, and now the perception was shifting. Lynn had seen something real, and Jasmine hadn't needed to show off or boast. Her actions had done all the talking. Still, Jasmine couldn't escape the thoughts running through her mind. She had just faced an emotional battle of sorts. The way the flight attendant, Marilyn, had acknowledged her own failure to stop the initial confrontation with the other staff member had resonated deeply with her. It wasn't the apology that meant so much, but the genuine self-awareness in Marilyn's eyes. The realization that she, too, had been caught in a system of silence. Jasmine knew that feeling. She had lived it for years. The expectations placed on her as a public figure had often made it difficult for her to act without scrutiny. But here, in the middle of the sky, with a group of strangers, she had acted because it was right. Not for applause, not for gratitude, but because she had learned long ago that doing what was right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, was what mattered most. Suddenly, there was a soft cough from behind her, and Jasmine turned to find an older woman standing in the aisle next to her seat. The woman's face was soft, lined with age but filled with warmth. She smiled faintly before speaking. "I hope you don't mind, but I just wanted to thank you. I'm one of the quiet ones, always keeping to myself. But what you did today, the way you handled that, it made me think maybe I should speak up more often, too." The woman's voice was almost a whisper, but the sincerity was evident. Jasmine blinked, taken aback for a moment. "I thank you. But really, I was just trying to do what anyone would have done." The woman shook her head. "I don't know about that. You did it without hesitation. You didn't get angry, didn't retaliate. It was like you knew what the right thing to do was." Jasmine was silent, processing her words. It was true. In the past, when faced with injustice or provocation, her first instinct had often been to fight back. But now, here she was, recognizing that the battles she fought didn't always have to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes the most powerful message was the one delivered quietly, with dignity. The woman lingered for a moment before continuing down the aisle, and Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her. It wasn't just the comfort of her seat, nor the gentle hum of the plane's engines that seemed to lull the cabin into a sense of ease. No, it was the shared recognition of something deeper. Jasmine knew that sometimes you didn't need to win every argument or confrontation. Sometimes simply holding your ground and staying true to yourself was enough to change the direction of things. Maybe that was the real power. Maybe that was the thing that had been missing in her life all along, the ability to stand firm, with quiet strength in the face of adversity. As the flight began its final approach toward the airport, the pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, signaling to the passengers that they would soon be descending. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated once again, and passengers began to prepare for landing. But there was a different energy now. The tension that had once filled the cabin had dissipated, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. They had all been witnesses to something important, not just the resolution of a conflict, but the unraveling of a greater truth. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment as the plane began its descent. The roar of the engines filling the air was deafening, but inside, there was nothing but silence. The weight of the past few hours had settled into her bones, and though she felt drained, she also felt a strange sense of peace. She had endured. She had faced the storm, and she had come out on the other side stronger for it. In the seat across from her, a young man, no older than 25, turned to her with a shy smile. "Hey," he said softly, as though testing the waters, "I just wanted to say you're amazing for handling everything so well." Jasmine smiled back at him, nodding. "Thank you," she replied simply, her voice calm but grateful. There was no need for anything more. He had seen what needed to be seen, and that was enough. The plane continued its descent, the runway now visible beneath them, and Jasmine Crockett sat there, not as the congresswoman who had been humiliated in front of a cabin of strangers, but as a woman who had regained control of her narrative. The flight may have been coming to an end, but her journey was far from over. With the final moments of the flight drawing near, she had come to realize that this moment, the small, almost unnoticed moment, had changed something inside her, and she would carry it forward no matter what came next. The plane touched down smoothly, the sudden shift of gravity signaling the end of a long journey, one that for Jasmine had felt like both a battle and a revelation. As the wheels met the runway, the cabin seemed to exhale in unison, a collective breath held in anticipation now released. The final moments of the flight felt almost surreal, as though the ground below had returned her to reality. But inside, Jasmine was no longer the same woman who had boarded this flight hours ago. She had walked through fire, and she had come out unscathed, stronger than ever. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, signaling the safe arrival, the passengers slowly began to gather their belongings, but something had shifted in the air. The flight attendants moved with a new sense of respect, and the passengers exchanged looks of acknowledgement. Jasmine caught snippets of conversations as the flight attendants passed by. "Did you see what she did? Unbelievable. She stood up for herself. I'd never have had the courage." It wasn't just the direct confrontation that had left an impression. It was the way she had held her ground without raising her voice, without letting anger take control. The calm strength she had displayed had become the story of the flight. And even now, as the plane taxied toward the gate, Jasmine could feel a strange sense of connection with these strangers, united in the shared experience of witnessing something profound. The overhead compartments clicked open, and passengers began to shuffle toward the exits, but Jasmine remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the crowd to thin out. Her thoughts swirled like the wind outside the window, the weight of the day pressing against her chest. It wasn't just the confrontation with the flight attendant, or the small but important exchange with the older woman that had stayed with her. It was the fact that she had finally allowed herself to take up space. In this chaotic, unpredictable world where power and influence often dictated the rules, she had stood firm. She had refused to shrink in the face of adversity, and for the first time in a long while, she felt free. The woman who had spoken to her earlier, the one who had quietly thanked her, had left an indelible mark on her heart. Jasmine wondered if the woman had realized what her words meant. She hadn't just spoken about Jasmine's courage. She had reflected a mirror back at her. The woman had seen something in her that Jasmine had long since forgotten, the quiet power of simply being true to oneself, even when the world is loud, even when everything inside urges you to back down. It was a power that didn't need to be flaunted or shouted about. It was a power that came from knowing your worth, even when others might try to diminish it. As Jasmine rose to grab her bag from the overhead compartment, she noticed a couple of passengers waiting for her by the aisle. The young man from earlier, the one who had praised her, stepped forward. "I just wanted to say one more thing. You really made me think about how I handle things. You didn't react with anger or rage. It was powerful." He hesitated, then added, "You're kind of a role model, you know." Jasmine felt a strange lump form in her throat. She smiled gently, acknowledging his words, but inside, She couldn't help but marvel at how something so simple could resonate so deeply with someone. It wasn't her position or title that had made the difference. It was her humanity. In that moment, that young man had seen her as more than just a congresswoman. He had seen her as a person, and that was what truly mattered. Before she could respond, the flight attendant who had been the center of the earlier conflict approached her. Jasmine's eyes narrowed for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Marilyn had approached her with hesitation, her hands clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl preparing for a reprimand. "I wanted to apologize," Marilyn began softly, "for earlier and for anything that made you feel uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention." Jasmine held her gaze steadily, sensing the sincerity in Marilyn's voice. The apology wasn't needed, but it was appreciated. "It's okay," Jasmine replied, her voice calm but firm. "I understand where you were coming from. We all have our roles to play, and sometimes we make mistakes. But what matters is how we handle them afterward." Marilyn blinked, clearly taken aback by Jasmine's response. "Thank you for understanding," she said quietly, before giving Jasmine a respectful nod and walking away. Jasmine stood there for a moment, the noise of the passengers now fading into the background. She was ready to step off the plane, to leave this experience behind. But something inside her told her that this moment was one worth remembering. It wasn't just about the confrontation or the apology. It was about what it represented. The willingness to confront the uncomfortable, to stand up for yourself and others when no one else will, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing peace over conflict. As she made her way down the jet bridge, Jasmine felt a deep sense of pride swell within her. The plane ride had been a microcosm of life itself, full of unexpected twists, difficult decisions, and moments of realization. But what she had learned on that flight wasn't just about standing up to someone. It was about standing up for herself. It was about finding the courage to live authentically, even when the world around you seems to push you into corners. Outside, the air was fresh, crisp with the promise of a new beginning. As Jasmine made her way toward the terminal, she felt the eyes of several passengers following her, nodding respectfully, perhaps even with admiration. She could hear snippets of conversation as she passed, their words an unspoken validation of her strength. She was incredible, handled it like a pro. "I want to be like her when I grow up." Jasmine Crockett walked out of the plane, not as a congresswoman, not as a politician, but as a woman who had stood up for herself and the people around her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, standing tall, strong, and unapologetically herself.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.